Good morning. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this event. Cannabis has become, I suppose, a huge focus of my day-to-day life over the last number of years in a way I wouldn't have imagined possible when I started out in my job as a child psychiatrist running a few adolescent addiction services in Dublin 18 years ago. Back then, the big worry was heroin. Cannabis, or hash as it was at that stage, generated some treatment demand, but it wasn't really a big source of worry for me. But that has all changed in a way I wouldn't have imagined possible. Cannabis is damaging the lives of young people in Dublin in a way that would have seemed ridiculous to me if you described it to me back in 2003. Picking up maybe where we ended up yesterday, I was really struck by Carlton's closing comments and his quote from Martin Luther King. And it really maybe captured for me in 4 words some of the anger I feel about this issue. The quote about the fierce urgency of now. We really are at a watershed time. This is not a time for passivity. It's not a time for pause and careful reflection. It is a time for now, the fierce urgency of now. We need to be vocal, we need to be clear, we need to recognize the threat that is there. Otherwise, I think we'll find ourselves on the other side of the watershed and grappling with a growing corporatized cannabis industry, which will prove as difficult to rein in and tackle as the tobacco industry was, as the asbestos industry was, and as the alcohol industry continues to be. We shouldn't let that happen. And parents are in the background. And parents are, they hear some of our voices of concern, but they hear relentless pro-cannabis propaganda, as do our teenagers. So I'm going to focus on that, I suppose. This isn't moving forward. Oh yeah, it is now, okay. Maybe linking a little bit to how Carlton finished yesterday as well. I suppose my first venture into the advocacy space, where I put my head above the public parapet to speak openly about substance use and the need for policy change, was very much focused on alcohol. Ireland has a well-deserved international reputation of being a nation of pretty heavy drinkers. I know that the Danish youth actually are probably up there in terms of competition, but I became a dad myself back in 2004, and I sort of became a bit worried about what sort of world my sons were going to grow up into, and I felt a need to try and influence and change that. And I think we've had some modest successes, but it's tough work, but important work. With colleagues on the clinical team I work with, we put together this book a few years ago, which looks at all aspects of adolescent substance use, looking at prevention and treatment. But again, important when thinking about teenagers, just to pull back a little bit from substance use, to think about what are adolescents, what are teenagers? And the way I sort of think about them now is that they are apprentice adults. And conceptualizing adolescence in this way makes our role as parents, as teachers, as members of the community, maybe a little bit clearer in terms of what our job is. As any apprentice is on a journey of picking up competencies and skills, and adolescents are picking up the competencies and skills that will equip them for independent adult life. They arrive into adolescence at the age of 10 or 11, really entirely dependent on mum and dad to manage their world for them. We hope that as they exit adolescence in their mid-20s, they will be able to stand on their own 2 feet. They will have picked up the skills to function independently. But they will have done so with the mentoring and support and scaffolding that we, the fully formed adults, provide around them. As with any apprentice, they're growing in skills, and as they grow in skills, they grow in confidence. Teenagers do differ. Most of them are good judges of where they're at in life, but some aren't. Their confidence is racing ahead of their competence. Those teenagers are harder to parent. They're the ones who are inclined, more precocious. They put themselves in risk situations, and they're the teenagers I'm more likely to meet in my clinical work. Generally, with apprentices, as they become more competent and capable, they take on additional responsibilities, and as they take on additional responsibilities, we give them additional freedoms and rights. If they demonstrate themselves unable to take on the responsibilities that might be appropriate for their chronological age, we sometimes have to rein in their rights and freedoms. That's what we would do. That's what I would do with an apprentice doctor. That's what an expert plumber would do with an apprentice plumber. That's what we as adults should do with our apprentice adults or adolescents. We need to look at where they're at and provide the degree of encouragement, opportunity, support, and restraint that's appropriate for the teenager in front of us. That's a pretty psychosocial spin on adolescence. As we heard yesterday, the human brain we now know is a work in progress and is developing and changing until the mid-20s, with the prefrontal cortex being the last bit of the human brain to fully develop. The prefrontal cortex is a little bit like the brain's braking system. It's the bit of the brain that sort of vets impulses and urges that are arising from perhaps the limbic system towards pleasurable, fun, exciting behavior. It's the bit of the brain that says, no, that's not a good idea. But it's the last bit of the human brain to fully develop. So biologically, adolescents are a little bit programmed to charge forward, but the brakes don't work so well. That's why our teenagers, why we ourselves, perhaps if we reflect back on our own lives and some of the things we have done or said that we might regret, a disproportionate number of those events will probably have occurred between the ages of 15 and 20. Our prefrontal cortex wasn't fully developed. I think an awareness, parents understanding that maybe helps them to understand why their sons and daughters maybe behave the way that they do, why they don't problem solve and anticipate threat and danger and hazard in the way that the parent thinks that they should. So one of the hazards that young people can face is their journey into the world of substance use. And this is sort of my diagram of that potential journey, where people start up in the top left-hand corner in the never use zone. As they venture into adolescence, some will engage in some experimental use, and they can move in that clockwise direction down towards SUD. The red zone is substance use disorder. And that, I suppose, diagram is just as applicable to crack cocaine as it is to cigarettes. Obviously in crack cocaine, the vast majority will never leave the never used category. For cigarettes and alcohol, most people probably do, even briefly. Society tries to intervene in that potential journey because as people move in that clockwise direction round towards substance use disorder, they're beginning to experience and cause more harm. And from a public health perspective, we want to keep that harm to a minimum. So we have laws, rules, and regulations for all sort of addictive and intoxicating substances to try and inhibit that progression towards more harmful or concerning patterns of use. We have primary prevention initiatives, largely school-based, but sometimes delivered via parents, where we're trying to equip young people with the knowledge, support, and skills to make it less likely that they venture into that world. We have secondary prevention, where we work with young people who've maybe taken a step into that world where we're trying to stop it progressing. There's brief interventions, often delivered in health settings, where we talk to adults attending our health services about their substance use, and we're trying to nudge it, I suppose, in a less harmful direction. Historically, treatment services worked with people with the most severe substance use disorders, dependence, and the explicit goal historically was always abstinence. You need to give up substances for good and forever. what has grown in prominence, I guess, across all treatment services around the world has been, I suppose, a recognition that that goal is not attainable for all clients in any given treatment episode, and there's a growing move towards setting interim goals with people with substance use disorders to try and modify their substance use in a direction of less harm. Looking at then what proportion of teenagers then venture into this world, particularly with a focus on cannabis, and how do those change over time, focusing on a few European countries. So the data here is from the SPAD survey, which is a survey conducted every 4 years in Ireland. So it's a little bit like the Monitoring the Future survey in the United States, although that occurs annually. 16-year-olds are interviewed about their substance use. And it's been going since the mid-1990s. So Ireland is there, Portugal is there, because it's a country that's often talked about, and Iceland is there, a country that probably should be talked about a little more. And you can see that in Ireland, certainly over the last 10 or 12 years, the proportion of teenagers using cannabis has been pretty static at around that sort of 8-9%. Portugal started from a low base in the 1990s and has moved upwards, something that seems to be ignored every time the conversation about Portuguese drug policy is discussed. Iceland also started at a low base in the 1990s, because one of the excuses for the rise of use in Portugal has been, well, it's a sort of a regression to the mean. Iceland shows that that isn't inevitable. Iceland started at a low base, about 4% reporting past month cannabis use, which is low, but they've actually gotten that to cut it in half down to about 2%. You've seen this slide before, so it's taken from the Global Burden of Disease Survey, which is open access information. Anyone can plug any particular disorder or problem into it and generate a pretty graph like that. And it's useful from a public health perspective, because generally in public health, what we do is we look around the world. If we're in Scandinavia now, so you look for the countries that are a darker blue than we are here, because they're doing even better than we are here. And we also look at the countries in red and we go, ooh, we definitely don't want to do what they're doing, because that's whatever policies they have in place, they're associated with increased harm. And all of that increased harm at the moment is clustered around North America. Now, it's been that way for the last 10 years or so. North America has gone on its own journey, but it's a journey that we should definitely learn from, but absolutely not replicate. Looking at the data from SPAD and then trying to compare that with data from the Monitoring the Future survey, focusing on 16-year-olds, but also drilling down, I suppose, into teenagers who are using the most harmful patterns of substance use. Teenagers who are using cannabis on a daily basis. So in the early 1990s in the United States, the Monitoring the Future survey, which the first year it included 10th grade students, said 0.8% were reporting daily use. In 2019, that was up to 4.8%. That's a six-fold increase in the proportion of teenagers who are using daily. Now, all of you will have heard the studies that sort of say, oh, we don't really know if medical marijuana laws or recreational cannabis laws are actually increasing use. Because you see study after study. You'll see one study that says they are and another study that says they aren't, and it looks like the science is unsettled. And that confusion is brilliant for those driving the drug normalization, legalization agenda. And that those conversations completely ignore this fact that before America embarked on its cannabis legalization, liberalization journey in the mid-1990s, because I think California was the first state to have medical cannabis back in 1996. Before it embarked on that journey, its rate of daily cannabis use wasn't much higher than was evident in Europe. Europe has kept it pretty low. United States, it's gone up six-fold. So if that's not caused by the incremental liberalization of North American cannabis policy, then I'd love to know what is the explanation. Because everything I know about alcohol policy and tobacco policy tells me that as you liberalize a policy regime, use increases and harms increase. And what confuses me a little is, as I said, these papers are published and they sort of say, oh, we don't really know if liberalizing laws is increasing youth use. And there was a paper in Journal of Adolescent Health that actually suggested the proportion of young people who were using frequently was reducing in the face of laws. And I go, it just makes no sense when you stand back and look at the big picture. And I'm confused a little bit, or have been a little bit confused by the silence on this from North America. Organizations have spoken out. The American Medical Association has said, legalization is a bad idea, but it doesn't say it very, very loudly, or certainly its communication of that position hasn't gained much traction with the American public. And maybe part of the challenge in shining a light on the extent of cannabis-related harm in the United States is the fact that it has coincided with this appalling opioid epidemic, which seems to have its origins actually in many of the same bad policies that are driving the issues around cannabis, which is, some dodgy actors massively exaggerating benefit, suppressing information about risk, corporatization, financial incentives. It's not good. You heard most of this yesterday, but I think this list is important. It's important for parents, it's important for policymakers, and it's important for us to keep in mind. This is why we do what we do, particularly for those of us who are concerned about young people. There is this broad range of risks that you heard about yesterday that can be associated, particularly with an early entry into the world of cannabis use, particularly if teenagers are using more potent cannabis, particularly if they're using more frequently. And there are a whole range of outcomes here that parents don't want to see happen to their children. Most of them you've heard about yesterday. There's a couple towards the bottom maybe I'll mention about, because it comes back to this idea of the apprentice adult, the journey that teenagers are on. We want our sons and daughters, one of the tasks they face as an apprentice adult is to learn how to manage tough times, learn how to manage disappointment, frustration, anger, stress. And society can sometimes encourage young people to we cope with these things by drinking, or we cope with them by getting stoned. And some young people will discover that using those approaches, actually it does seem to provide a bit of short-term relief. And the worry is that teenagers who turn to intoxication or getting stoned as a method of coping with emotional distress can then arrive into adulthood with this as their coping strategy. And if their substance use becomes highly problematic, they come to a treatment service, we say, oh, you need to stop doing that. We're actually removing from them their one coping strategy. So that, it becomes incumbent upon treatment providers, if in those instances, to try and work with those young people to give them the skills to manage, distressing mood states. The other thing we want teenagers to do, we want them to have fun. We want them to, switch off, wind down, chill out with their friends. We want them to let go, I suppose, and to be able to do that. Because life should have some fun in it too. But again, the worry is for teenagers who, when in that sort of social fun space, allow intoxication to become absolutely central to that experience, then they never really acquire the skill to let go, to chill out, to have fun while not intoxicated. So it's an extra reason to delay, I suppose, the introduction of intoxicants into the adolescent world, to give them the opportunity to have fun with their pals and mates free of intoxicating substances. If they want to introduce something in their 20s or whatever, when they're already able to sort of socialize and have fun, that's less of a worry. So I've sort of mentioned this already, and this is data from our treatment service. So the yellow bar is the percentage of clients accessing our service presenting with each of these substances as their primary addiction issue. And you can see for the last few years, cannabis drives as the dominant substances in about 80% of referrals. despite Ireland's reputation of being a nation of drinkers, actually alcohol, either as primary or secondary substance, is only involved really in about 20% of referrals. And Ireland isn't unique, and it's not unique to adolescents. This is data from the EMCDA annual report, and it's the number of people seeking addiction treatment for the first time in Europe, saying, my main problem is cannabis. And that has increased by about 60 or 70% over the last decade or so. And it's gone largely untalked about. It's just sort of become the new normal. When you read the EMCDA reports each year, and I do, the headline only ever talks about cocaine, because there's a bit of an increase in cocaine presentations over the last few years. The number of people presenting seeking treatment for cocaine is about half that for cannabis. So you'd imagine the EMCDA's primary concern would be cannabis, but I see no evidence at all that the EMCDA has any particular concern about the extent of cannabis addiction in Europe. You're going to see a few of these sort of slides which relate to, I think, some of the anti-cannabis propaganda from books and movies in the United States back in the 1950s. And I used to use these slides as really good examples of how to do prevention work really badly. Because they always seem to exaggerate and caricature just how bad cannabis addiction was and how problematic it was for the young people who run into problems with that substance. I now look at those books and those cartoons and I wonder, Jesus, you know, maybe they actually saw something in this drug that I didn't see. Because certainly young people we meet talk about being addicted to cannabis in the exact same way that the young people I used to meet who were addicted to heroin talked about being addicted to heroin, or adults who are addicted to alcohol talk about being addicted to it. It consumes their lives. And it doesn't just affect them. And these quotes here from some qualitative research, you know, highlight the influence of parents on teenagers' substance use, but also teenagers' recognition of the impact of their behavior on the whole home environment and the distress and upset and angst it brings into the home environment. And the way in which cannabis changes you. This 17-year-old girl, it's like it turns you into something you are not, or someone you are not. And this is a quote from a parent of one of the young people attending our service. And again, part of the reason I emphasize this is a lot of the conversation around cannabis comes from that libertarian perspective. You know, I can do whatever I want to do. If I want to take risks with myself, really what business is it of yours? And it's caused me to think about some of the arguments that have been effective in alcohol policy arena, because in alcohol policy you get that same pushback. Well, they let adults do what they want to do. It doesn't affect you. How dare you tell me how I can live my life? That ignores the issue of harm to others. And I think the issue of cannabis-related harm to others is an important one to bring into the conversation, because it actually partly explains why we do intrude to some extent on individual liberties and how that can be an appropriate thing to do in some instances. This parent is just talking about the distress she experiences, but the distress her cannabis-dependent son's 10-year-old brother was experiencing too. And this issue of family distress and upset is something, again, that really blindsided me within our service about sort of 6 or 8 years ago. Again, you know, I started off with a heroin treatment service, right? But with cannabis-dependent teenagers, probably the most common complaint that the parents will make is that of anger and aggression and violence, which sort of counters completely this notion of the chilled out sort of cannabis user and the argument that the legalization community make, which would that if everyone was just stoned on a Friday night, the world would just be such a happy place. Instead, we have all these angry drunk people. But certainly I think the parents of our service would perhaps swap their irritable, angry, dysregulated 16, 17-year-old sons who are aggressive and threatening towards them, who seem miserable themselves for some other sort of substance use problem. And partly in response to the huge numbers of parents identifying this problem, our service with a family therapist on the team, and she developed expertise in a treatment approach called nonviolent resistance, which was really developed actually in Israel to work with people experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence situations, try and give them the skills to deal with that. But we have adapted that for work with teenagers to try and give parents the skills to try and, one, they're trying to reconnect with their angry, aggressive sons, and it usually is sons, while also managing the threat and danger that seems to come with that, both for the teenager and for themselves. Part of my remit was to talk about gender differences, so I'm going to have a few slides on that. Our service deals with primarily boys. We probably have, amongst those with cannabis use disorder, there's probably 8 boys for every 1 girl. And when we've looked at a population level data, what that seems to suggest is that boys are a little bit more likely than girls to try cannabis. Of those who try cannabis, it's the boys who are more likely to persist with use. And of those who persist with use and continue to use currently, it's the boys who tend to use more heavily. So the boys are sort of been, selected out, I suppose, at each stage of that potential journey, and that for me explains why we have so many boys attending the service. The girls are different though, and where the girls attend treatment, what we would have noticed, and a number of researchers internationally have noted similar findings, they are more likely to present with emotional problems, comorbid psychological issues. So this data is from our own service again. It's from an instrument called the Beck's Youth Inventory, which assesses affective states and mood symptoms, and then it normalizes that or compares that to same age, same gender normal population. So this tells you, how different your group are from the same age and the same gender. And you see the boys there in blue, there's a significant minority who are experiencing sort of mood problems in each of these domains, but actually they don't stand out as being terribly different from boys in general in those domains. The girls you see are very different from their same age, same gender peers, and they're also very different from the boys. And it's hard to explain that. It makes me wonder, is there sort of I think there's multiple different etiological pathways into a substance use disorder as an adolescent. There isn't a single pathway. And I think maybe it's just that for girls, that pathway that involves using substances as a method of managing dysregulated mood is perhaps a more common pathway than it is for boys. I think the more common pathway for boys is more connected with peer affiliation, peer connection, that sense of camaraderie and just doing something together, which is like what boys often seem to want to do, whether it's watching a football match or smoking weed. I've got ASD there as well. Autistic spectrum disorder. If you'd asked me 10 or 12 years ago, I would have said autistic spectrum disorder was a protective factor that made it less likely that a young person was going to embark down a path of substance use problems. And I think that's certainly still the case for autism, which is the extreme end of the autistic spectrum, I suppose. But for that milder end, we would have noticed within our service just a growing minority of clients who are arriving into the service with that diagnosis. It could be as many as 20% at this stage of our clients have an ASD diagnosis. And trying to make sense of that, it comes back to that idea of the peer connection piece. Because, with classic autism, people really don't have any great interest in human connection. They don't have the skills or the interest. At the ASD, at the milder end of the spectrum, people have deficiencies in their skills around communication and social connection, but they have the desire for it. So what we would have observed amongst the clients who attend our service is that many of them had pretty lonely, isolated childhoods. They were the ones who were sort of left out of the group. They didn't really have a tribe. They didn't really have a gang. And suddenly then they start smoking weed, or someone says, do you want to smoke a joint? And they go, oh, okay. And then it becomes something to do. They get a sense of belonging and peer connection That's really important for them. And it's important for human beings. We want to connect with people. But this is their first ever experience of peer connection, peer affiliation, been part of a group, been welcomed, been able to chat and talk about something, and everyone's shared passion for weed. But for them, it can become more problematic. And the tragedy for them in that situation, if that's been their journey into problematic cannabis use, they come to us and we're sort of saying, this cannabis use doesn't seem to be working out for you, and they might agree it's not working out well at all. Their school performance is damaged, they're getting into debt, it's causing distress and upset at home. But it's their one source of social connection and peer affiliation, and you can't ask me to give that up, can you? So it's tough. It's tough for young people in that situation to step back from that world, because it isn't just a simple chemical effect of the THC that has them trapped in that behavior. It is that piece of social connection that they get from being part of the cannabis using group. I don't know, Cressida, what do you want to do? We do questions at the end? Is that okay? At the end?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I should see if it's working. About the social status, do you have any recommendations to say to the young people to get another network, or if it's the only thing?
That's very obvious. Yes, absolutely. That's what we would be suggesting. But that's challenging if you have ASD, I suppose.
It's very challenging.
It can be challenging for any teenager to suddenly completely shift and change your peer group, but it's extra challenging if you have an ASD diagnosis, because you have less skills in that area than the average teenager does. So it's just a bigger jump for them. Of course, a key piece of our work for all teenagers who attend our service, where their whole lifestyle has become immersed in a world of substance use and affiliating with other teenagers who use substances, is trying to step back from that while replacing it with something else. You can't just step back from that and hide in your room for the rest of your life. So it's really important to have alternative social connection. But for some young people, they really need their hand held by us, or ideally actually by their parent, to introduce them into other social contexts where they do have that opportunity for social connection outside of the substance use.
But what about a boy at 17 years old? He has
ADHD?
Yes.
Yeah, ADHD is a risk factor for movement into the world of substance use. Teenagers with ADHD are a bit more impulsive, a bit less inclined to reflect on risks and hazard, and therefore more likely to give themselves permission to venture into the world of substance use and to stay there when they get there. And that makes it extra challenging for them to exit that. So I suppose the usual treatment approach would again be largely similar, but you ideally want to treat their ADHD as best as possible as well, while I suppose recognizing that it can be a little bit more challenging in the presence of that disorder to stick with and persist with change on a consistent basis.
Thank you.
Okay. It's important at a broad policy level again, because I think one of the clear goals, as I see it, of the legalization movement is to instill in society, in policymakers, a sense of nihilism, a sense of hopelessness. The drug problem is getting worse. There's nothing we can do about it. All the past policies are a failure. That's not true. It's simply not true. Again, in Ireland, my journey into addiction treatment was in the midst of a heroin epidemic that really destroyed hundreds, thousands of young lives in Dublin back in the mid-1990s. We used to have, about 180, nearly 200 children under 18 every year saying, I'm addicted to heroin in Dublin. So it's gone from about 180 a year to 1 or 2 a year. Okay, it's dropped by 98% in terms of its incidence. That's success. Iceland, again, is a country I've already touched on. They've achieved success. How did they do it? a lot of us have heard of the Icelandic or Planet Youth model. I think what they've done is really impressive. I think it makes a lot of sense to me, actually, as a doctor. It seems to me a bit like a clinical audit type process where you measure a problem, you look at its correlates, you try and intervene to target some of those correlates that seem associated with the risk behavior you're trying to target. You remeasure it, and you do that year on year, and you build on incremental change. And I think what they've done is pretty remarkable. That their real worry at the start was their drunken teenagers. They had the most drunken teenagers in Europe. But they've gone from the most drunken teenagers in Europe to the least drunken teenagers in Europe. And along the way, they've kept their relatively low levels of drug use lower. And a big part of that was seeing the importance of parents. Their research told them that kids who had poor connection with family, who were poorly embedded within sort of the adults, the scaffolding system that adults provided, were more likely to have substance use problems. So they built an expectation. They made it incumbent on parents. They said, you should know where your kids are. You should be really actively viewed as your job to try and include your teenager into your family life and not just say, oh, they're 15 now, they're going to be out and about with their pals all evening, every evening. Linked to that, and I think very consistent with that Icelandic model, and something I'd heard about, I suppose, before I ever heard about Planet Youth, was the 40 developmental assets. And I talk about this really no matter who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to parents, if I'm talking to teachers, if I'm talking to policymakers or other doctors, I tend to come back to the 40 developmental assets time and again. And it's really intuitive. It's, again, American researchers. They looked at the evidence base for risk and protective factors. And they decided to move the conversation away from risk factors, which is what doctors tend to focus on, and to focus on protective factors, which they call assets. And these assets can be in a young person's life, or they may not be. And they divided up those assets into what they called internal assets, which are sort of intrinsic characteristics of the teenager, which you can try and nurture and encourage as a parent, but you can't suddenly decide one day to put it in place. But you can sort of influence its development, the internal assets. Then there's 20 external assets, and these are the things that it is our job as the adults, as parents, as school teachers, as community members, to put in place for our sons and daughters. And the good news is you don't need 40 out of 40 assets to have a good outcome. Teenagers with over 20, but even better if there's over 30 of the 40 assets, exhibit much lower rates of these problematic behaviors. That's less issues with depression, less issues with alcohol and drug use, and less aggression and violence. So what are the assets? And I'm not going to go through all 40 of them. If you just Google 40 developmental assets, you'll get the full list. Some of them are, a bit more esoteric or abstract, but young people who are more committed to their own future, more committed to education, who report more connection with school, these are all advantages for that young person. It's good for young people to embrace what we would call positive values, I suppose, the sense of integrity, personal responsibility, and to exhibit restraint. Again, some teenagers naturally exhibit these characteristics, others much less so, some not at all. And it's good to be socially competent, and this comes back to our kids with ASD. They tend to be less good in these domains, but some kids are wonderful in these areas of planning, decision-making, building and maintaining friendships. For kids who are blessed with those abilities, that's a real asset for them. And it's good to have sort of a positive sense of yourself, some awareness that I'm on a journey and I'm pretty optimistic about where this journey is going to take me. Again, some teenagers demonstrate that, others not at all. The external assets are ones we have more direct influence over. And I suppose these fall into two areas. One is the nice side of parenting, and the other is the tough side of being an adult, I suppose. So the nice side is the support bit, about love and communication, and ideally there's other adults around your son or daughter, not just the parent. That could be their granddad. It could be the soccer coach. It's good for young people to live in communities where they feel valued, where they're given roles. So the stereotypical view that society has of teenagers, that they're I don't know, they're lazy, they're selfish, they're promiscuous, they're only interested in themselves. All those negative and unfair stereotypical attitudes that we have of teenagers maybe cause us to not include them as much as we should. So it throws the gauntlet down to us as a society. And again, I think they've done this reasonably well in Iceland, is to really expect young people to be active members of the community. And then there's the tougher side of our role as mentors of our apprentice adults. Kids who live in homes where there's rules, expectations, consequences, where they go to schools where those same things exist, they're advantageous. Number 15 is positive peer influence. Again, we tend to think of peer pressure in a negative way, but if you're a precocious risk taker but happen to affiliate with a bunch of friends who are a bit more sensible and cautious, your friends or your peer network can pressurize you into making more sensible choices. So it just depends on who your peers are. So developmental psychologists talk about this issue of scaffolding, and that's the support that we as adults place around young people. And that's actually a picture of me from 1980 in the middle, surrounded by my parents with my school in the background. And I was fortunate enough to have, I think, a lot of scaffolding around me. And I appreciate not everyone is as lucky. But the conversation around parenting, we hear these words regularly. There's authoritative parenting in the top right-hand corner. Okay, that's seen as the holy grail. That's the goal for us as parents. Whether you've got a 6-year-old, a 16-year-old, or even a 26-year-old, actually, the goal, the challenge is to be in that authoritative space in the top right-hand corner. And this relates to research carried out by Diane Baumrind, who I think was slightly shocked by the amount of attention her research generated, because it's been massively influential in terms of how we think about parenting. She just broke up parenting into 2 dimensions. One was responsiveness, which is that piece of parenting which is the nice bit, which is the bit about being loving and affectionate and empathic and communicating. And she said that's really important. We want lots of that. But the other side of parenting that she measured was what she called it demandingness. Okay, maybe not the best word, but that's what she called it. And demandingness means having high expectations, having monitoring, having rules, having some consequences. And lots of that is apparently good too. So authoritative parenting is simultaneously high on responsiveness and high on demandingness. And oftentimes when I'm listening to experts on the television, parenting experts talk about parenting, they're really strong at emphasizing responsiveness. And that's good, because I think historically society, particularly dads, haven't been great on that responsiveness. And it's good that we're being encouraged to move in that direction. But there's probably not enough talk about the need simultaneously for demandingness. And this reflects my age again, but for those of you who watched TV as children, and maybe in the 1970s, The Little House on the Prairie was a big program. And these are 2 children who lived in very different families. One family demonstrated, I think, authoritative parenting. The other was permissive parenting. So that's Laura Ingalls on the right, Nellie Olson on the left. And I guess it's sort of, maybe an example that sometimes resonates for parents of my age anyway, about the outcome, the product of different parenting approaches. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with Nellie Olson, but she didn't have many friends. She wasn't a particularly nice girl. And she was pretty miserable. But she was massively indulged and spoiled by her parents, who lived in fear of her. Whereas, Laura Ingalls lived in a family where there was rules, there was consequences, there was chores, there was jobs to be done, but there was no doubt about her parents' commitment towards her. And that sort of is an example I sometimes use when I'm talking to parents. Because, again, as parents, we influence our kids in lots of different ways, and the assets approach emphasizes our role as role models. And what we do influences how our kids view us. And In Ireland, I'm usually talking about drinking, but drinking or drug use by parents, are you demonstrating that at home? And how do you use alcohol? So I drink, but I definitely drink differently now that I'm a dad, and I drink differently in front of my kids than maybe I might when I'm out with my, adult male friends. And it's how we drink or use substances that our kids are learning from. And this could be a 6-year-old is learning from you. You come in from work, I had a dreadful day at work, I'm opening a bottle of wine. Your 6-year-old is going, oh, that's interesting. This is how adults deal with stress. Good, I'm noted for the future. But we don't want our kids to learn that coping strategy from us, even if it is one that we choose to employ ourselves. And in Ireland, property's become terribly expensive, so we have loads of young adults now, children at home. So you've got kids well into their 20s staying at home with mum and dad, but there's maybe a 15-year-old in the house as well. But the 24-year-old is saying, listen, hey, you don't make the rules anymore. I'm an adult now, you can't tell me what to do. But they're modeling a style of drinking potentially that the 15-year-old is going, oh, really? That's what you do before you go out? You pour a bottle of wine into yourself? Okay, noted for the future, or maybe noted for next weekend. So as parents in that situation, I think it's good to have a house rule. No one in this house, whether they're 53, 23, or 13, pours a bottle of wine into themselves before they go out. It's not acceptable in our home. And that the young adults who happen to stay at home still have to operate within boundaries and rules as well. Because the younger teenagers are noticing. If your youngest is 23, well, you can maybe, worry a little bit less. There's also the issue of that tendency maybe we have to reminisce and talk about our own past drunken or maybe even our drug-using adventures ourselves in front of our kids. This may be more likely to happen when you're with your friends. Your friends go around for dinner. Maybe your 16-year-old son is at the table as well, and it goes back to your drunken adventures in Greece, in Eos back in 1986. You want to shut that conversation down while your 16-year-old is in the room. We don't want to normalize and glamorize our own past substance use in front of our kids. Again, it comes back to the fact because parents matter. This is a slide I got from some British research back about 10 years ago. And I asked, young people of different ages, whose opinion matters to you, your friends, your teachers, your parents. But at every age, first of all, what parents notice is, my 16-year-old, he doesn't pay as much attention to me now as he did when he was 12. And you go, no, he doesn't. But he actually doesn't pay as much attention to anyone now at 16 than he did at the age of 12. He cares less about your opinion. He cares less about teacher's opinion. He actually cares a bit less about his friend's opinion. But there's no other group who have a bigger influence on your son's perspective on the world than you right now. He won't tell you that. He'll tell you don't matter at all, you don't have a clue, you're stupid, you're a dinosaur. But the research tells us that on average, there's no bigger single influence on our sons and daughters' perspective on the world and on big issues than their parents. And I suppose that's a message I try to labor with parents, because parents can feel disempowered. They feel like I've got no influence anymore. And I'm not saying it's that way for everyone, but on average, that's the case. So I know I meant to get on to specifically about alcohol and drugs. So I suppose my advice then to parents is, first of all, the parents need to have a united front. If there's two parents at home, one of them is going to be a bit more easygoing about drinking and drug use than the other. It's important that mum and dad come together, or both parents come together to have a conversation about, well, where is the line? What are we comfortable with here or not? And what's the plan we can both stick with? And most of the research on this area is focused on alcohol, and it does basically endorse the authoritative parenting approach. It evidences the fact that young people are less likely to venture into a world of harmful drinking or drug use if there's lots of love, affection, and communication, but also some rules, monitoring, and consequences. And some of those rules can be specific to alcohol. Number 2 there is interesting, because a lot of parents do this in Ireland. I'm not sure how it is here. They give their 14-year-old drink thinking, I'm doing you a favor now by giving you this, because I'm going to teach you how to use it responsibly. The evidence is that doesn't work. It actually makes things worse. When a 14-year-old is given parental permission to drink, albeit with loads of caveats, that 14-year-old is more likely to give himself permission to drink or use drugs in other contexts than a 14-year-old who is denied that permission at home. Okay? It doesn't mean the 14-year-old who's denied permission doesn't drink outside of home. They're just, on average, they do drink less. So given permission, it's often done with good intentions, doesn't work. And while that last review focused on alcohol, the evidence from a range of studies seems to back up the same approaches in terms of parental influence on reducing the likelihood of teenagers running into cannabis problems. And having decided what the parental approach is going to be, then it's important to have that conversation then with your son or daughter. Emphasizing a bit, we want them to grow and develop and embark out into the world and have a fun, interesting, exciting life. But while we see them making good, wise choices, we'll give them more opportunity and more freedom. But once we see them making poor choices and putting themselves at risk and potentially compromising their own futures, we will step in and seek to put obstacles in the path of any further movement in that direction, while recognizing we don't have absolute control, but we do have influence as parents. When things are going well, I think it's important not to take it for granted. Do affirm positive decision making by your sons and daughters. Where things don't go well, intervene, respond. There's some minor consequence for breach of the rules, but don't hold a grudge. Don't endlessly bang on about that one bad decision they made 6 months ago. Parenting happens within a context, though, and that context is getting tougher from a cannabis perspective. There is a growing corporatization of cannabis. This reminds me exactly of what's happening in terms of alcohol over the last number of decades. They use all sorts of front organizations. There's lots of waffle and noise about things like social justice. This has nothing to do with social justice. Social justice arguments were used by the alcohol industry. They've been used by the fossil fuel industry. They're used by every industry when they're trying to stand against regulations that damage their bottom line and profitability. And parents, though, are being bombarded with this information, telling them that the laws are wrong, the laws are ineffective, cannabis is good, cannabis is harmless. And there's this real game of smoke and mirrors, which is why we need to get noisier. And one of the things I really struggle with is medical cannabis. It's a real, I just view it as a con. I view it as it's part of $1 trillion con, which is all about the creation of a new $1 trillion industry. And it's been tried and tested and proven route to legalization in North America. And there's huge energy behind it happening here now as well. Mary Cannon, I think, had this slide yesterday. So this is an essay by a guy called Professor Burns in the UK, extolling the virtues of something called medical cannabis. 18 weeks later, despite the fact he declared no financial connection with this company he then subsequently sold reportedly for many millions, that was reported in the media just 18 weeks later. The British Medical Journal published this. The British Medical Journal is a journal I think most of us would have respect for and feel we can trust around transparency. But it really makes me wonder, God, if I can't trust major scientific journals to really be crystal clear about massive conflicts of interest, who can I trust? And then just a week or two ago, the British Medical Journal published this. And this is, again, another, pain is key to the medical cannabis movement. Pain is the license to basically, dispense medical cannabis to anyone and everyone because it's subjective. And most European countries have been very slow to allow approvals of use of medical cannabis for pain. But this article, which is put together by Canadian researchers, so I looked into who are these people, and as I read down through it, there's this guy, Dr. Ware. He's the co-principal investigator. He's on the management team of a company called Canopy Growth, and it says at the bottom, he's the chief medical officer with Canopy Growth. This article is going to be read by pain specialists. Pain specialists don't have a clue who Canopy Growth is. Who is Canopy Growth? Well, Canopy Growth is one of the multi-billion-dollar Canadian corporations that sells medical cannabis, but also sells cannabis into the recreational adult use market. It's one-third owned, more than one-third owned, by the makers of Corona beer. So this RCT, or meta-analysis, is led by someone who's employed by the cannabis industry. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong in and of itself, but that's as profound a conflict of interest as you can get. And a journal like the BMJ should be making that crystal clear in bold or at the top of the page. So pain specialists can go, do I want to read an article that's written by an industry that is really aligned to the alcohol industry? Is that who I want to get my advice from or not? And while that article very helpfully said medical cannabis was effective in some cases in terms of pain, and a number of international bodies with no industry affiliation have said it's ineffective. But it's that mixed messaging that confuses people. And those articles generated no headlines that I'm aware of internationally, or minimal headlines, whereas the previous article, assisted by the PR money that would come with the cannabis legalization agenda, was in newspapers all around the world. Doctors say medical cannabis is good for pain. So the first thing I do, actually, now when I see any paper that seems favorable towards cannabis, is I spend a bit of time, that game of Russian dolls, sort of saying, who's actually behind this? And I'm stunned at the frequency with which I see industry there, and it's not really nearly clear enough. And the medical cannabis agenda has been really effective. There's a quote from John Collins, who worked with the Open Society Foundation-funded London School of Economics in the UK. He's a good friend to the cannabis legalization agenda, and he's crystal clear about what happened in the States. You know, the more you talk about cannabis as a medicine, the public think, oh, really? Because it's brilliant. I mean, we're talking about its harms. They don't get into an argument about, well, it doesn't cause harm. They're going way beyond that. They're going, this isn't just harmless. It's actually good for you. So there's difficulty for parents. Whatever advice we give them, whatever knowledge we equip them with, they are being bombarded with other information, and that makes their job tougher. And again, thinking about positive change and how change is positive, or is possible. Look at tobacco. Look at the massive decline in tobacco smoking amongst adolescents across the Western world over the last 40 years. It's a real triumph. But what's helped that is absolutely consistent messaging from everyone. Doctors say smoking causes addiction. Smoking causes a whole range of health problems. That's no longer debated. It used to be debated. There used to be disputes as whether or not cigarettes caused cancer up until the 1960s. But the messaging over the last 50 years on tobacco has been absolutely consistent. No deviation from the hymn sheet. We don't allow the tobacco industry to advertise. We don't allow them, give them a platform to hit young people with any misinformation. And rates of use have declined because young people are not on a mission of self-destruction. And when given balanced, wise information from adults who care about them, will, in the majority of cases, make sensible choices. On alcohol, there is some mixed messaging. There's still lots of advertising and sports sponsorship, which doesn't help. But I do see certain movements and changes that cause me to have some optimism. And I guess from a parenting perspective, there's lots of additional voices saying to their sons and daughters, along with them as parents, that drink is something best kept out of your life for the moment. With regard to cannabis, there really is, it isn't just mixed messaging, there's really actively pro-cannabis messaging, telling them that laws are ineffective, inappropriate, telling them that this is a medicine. Okay, I meant to finish up in a couple of minutes, but I know I've been talking mainly about prevention, but we would view family as central to our treatment approach as well. We know from not just our own experience, but international research, where parents are involved in the treatment process in an active way, young people have better outcome. The parents arrive into the service oftentimes angry and frustrated with their son, feeling guilty and ashamed about how things have worked out themselves, and that's all negative and disempowering, I suppose, and we're trying to harness the energy that the parents have about wanting things to be better for their sons and daughters, but to move that in a more positive direction. And where parents have got different views or different perspectives, and we're trying to get them to work together to have a united front. The treatment model that we would largely use, or the scaffolding around which we build treatment, is an adapted American model, which is the adolescent community reinforcement approach. And elements of that involve or include work with the parent or caregiver to try and rebuild connection. I already mentioned this nonviolent resistance approach, which is useful in those instances to support parents where there's lots of aggression and threat and intimidation within the family home. And that approach is, there's a growing literature around that. Okay, so in conclusion, I think it's helpful to view teenagers as apprentice adults. It helps us frame for ourselves what our role is in terms of guiding them on that journey. As they grow in competence, we give them increased autonomy. Cannabis, as with pretty much every other substance, brings many risks into the lives of teenagers, and the longer they delay their move into the world of cannabis use, the better, and ideally not at all. The etiology or the common etiological pathways into cannabis use disorder may differ by gender, but ultimately the treatment response is largely the same. To really emphasize to parents that they are the biggest single influence on their teenagers, even if they are swimming against the tide of alternative influences. That's really important to retain optimism, to try and encourage parents to be optimistic about their capacity of their son or daughter to change, and at a broad policy and societal level, for us to remain optimistic about our ability to influence change. That I suppose those two elements of the role of parenting, which is about communication, connection, but also boundaries, rules, consequences, those two aspects are important really at reducing the risk of problems in the first place, but equally where problems have emerged, about turning the ship around again and moving in a more positive direction. So thanks very much.
Thank you for your great words and for your great contribution on the role of parents and how important they are and how much influence they can have on their children, and also to see how what you said with medical marijuana, how that has kind of shown different effects in different regions of the world, and we will go more into that this afternoon. But before that, I would like to ask you some questions we got from the online audience, sorry. We got a question from Nina Hareke. How do you adjust the treatment to suit girls?
I suppose, in truth, I don't think we modify the treatment massively for girls versus boys. I think that route into cannabis use or cannabis dependence or drug dependence against the backdrop of emotional, psychological issues is more common for girls, but we do see it occasionally with boys. So what we try to do, irrespective of gender, is to look at each individual's journey into problematic substance use. You're looking at their strengths, their weaknesses, but not just within themselves, but within the family system, the community system, and you're trying to then target a treatment response building on the strengths while targeting the areas of weakness at each of those levels. And we do that whether the client is male or female.
Yeah, thank you. A second question from Britt Vredeman is the support for parents who have pregnant teenage daughters and their infants where the risk of lifelong deterioration is high due to addictive cannabis products during pregnancy?
I suppose I work with adolescents under the age of 18. It's actually teenage pregnancy was a bigger issue maybe 20, 25 years ago. It's actually a relatively rare issue amongst our client group nowadays. I know from the social work services perspective, where a young person is grappling with addiction and does find themselves pregnant, there is additional supports put in place with the goal of trying to maximize the likelihood that that child has a good outcome, but really working towards trying to support that young parent in their task of parenting.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one more question if there is one in the audience. Here? No? Then, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, maybe forgive me if I missed it or something like that, about the gender paradox, if you could elaborate more on that. And at the same time, I was wondering if working with gender norms comes into play in your experience when working, turning the previous questions about gender a little bit on the other side. If, for example, issues, called like toxic masculinity or in other terms come into these situations, because when you were showing the slide about the emotional issues being as a factor, I just started wondering about that, because there's always something that may also come from family, this Tony Soprano style strong silent type where a boy has to kind of stay put and be a man and not talk about his emotional issues. So it's a two-pronged question, but if those come in.
Okay, so the first part was the gender paradox and what I meant by that. That's something that's talked about in the prevention and treatment literature more generally. It relates to an observation that in a number of disorders or conditions, that in the gender in which the condition is more rare or encountered less frequently, paradoxically, the presentations tend to be more complicated and oftentimes have poorer outcomes. The example perhaps for males is breast cancer. Breast cancer it can occur in males as well. It's rare, much rarer than it is in females, but where it does occur, it tends to have a poorer prognosis. That's a medical example, I suppose, of the gender paradox. Psychologically, it's girls who are diagnosed with things like conduct disorder, and I think, as we would find in our own service, with a substance use disorder, even though they're less numerous than the boys, they do tend to present with a more complex range of difficulties. And in terms of your other question about sort of gender norms, I suppose where boys are caught up in a sense of their status as a boy that's linked into their drug use and the behaviors that go with that. That's certainly something that will feature into the individual work done with them about helping them think through the pros and cons of continuing to do that. But it's funny, as you asked your question, rather than thinking of the boys, I was once again thinking more about the girls. And again, I think I had a note on that slide about sort of the double standards in society, right? Society is more accepting of male drug use than it is of female drug use. So for the girls who venture into that world, they're sort of judged in a negative way. There's more stigma as a girl venturing into that world. So once they cross into that watershed, they're more likely to have their friends, their female friends, turn their back on them than a boy is who ventures into that world, which leaves them more isolated and then makes it harder for them to get back out of it. In terms of that gender, the challenges, I suppose the influence of gender upon substance use, the journey into it, and also the challenges of exiting it.
Okay, still one more last question from the audience online what is the methods you must use for prevention in the cannabis for adolescents for school and universities from Moro?
Prevention in what context?
Which methods do you have to use for cannabis prevention for adolescents in
Adolescents,
schools?
okay. Adolescents in schools. So within schools, again in Ireland, and I think this would be standard enough international practice, you're really trying to focus quite globally that you're not running a don't do this sort of program. What you're trying to do is run a program. So in Ireland, we call it the social personal health education. You're trying to give people and teenagers, I suppose, a set of skills and competencies and values that make them less likely to move into that world, while equipping them with knowledge and information that they understand the hazards and risks of moving into the world of cannabis use, while not exaggerating those risks. And it's best delivered really by a teacher that they know, rather than parachuting in an expert like me. So I often get invitations from schools, will you come in and talk to the teenagers? And I pretty much always say no to that. But I say I will talk to the person who is talking to the teenagers. I will talk to the teacher who's running the SPHE program, because oftentimes teachers feel a bit de-skilled around this conversation. They feel like, oh, the teenagers will know more about it than I do. And there's elements of truth in that, but it's still best done as a prevention intervention, either actually by peers who are knowledgeable or by a teacher who already has a relationship with the teenager, rather than by an expert externally.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. I would like to officially thank you from all the organizers with a little gift from Denmark.
Thank you.
And hope to bring it with you back to Dublin.
Thank you.
A big applause.